Central Great Plains, 1878. Temperature dropping from 48 degrees at sunset toward freezing by midnight. Wind steady at 10 to 15 miles per hour, enough to strip heat from a man in under an hour. A lone traveler, separated from his wagon before dusk, kneels into the tall grass and begins pulling it by the armful. Frontier wisdom said keep moving, light a fire, signal from high ground. But he'd learned from plains tribes that grass, packed thick and kept low, could trap body heat better than flame. Settlers called grass shelters primitive, something only native people with nothing else would use. He ignored every instinct to stay visible and instead vanished downward into the prairie. By midnight, temperatures reached near freezing. Fingers would go numb in 20 minutes without shelter. At dawn, wagon tracks appeared less than 40 yards away. A mounted search party had passed during the night. The shelter's profile never rose above the grass tops. No smoke, no movement, no silhouette. Had he stood, waved, or built a fire, exposure likely would have killed him before rescue. What did he understand about insulation, wind, and concealment that frontier search doctrine completely missed? If you value real history with lessons, subscribe. Comment your city and time so we know where this reached. The air had been cooling since mid-afternoon, dropping from 48 degrees at sunset toward the low 30s. He felt it through his coat first, then his fingers, then the base of his spine where the wind found gaps in the fabric. He'd been separated from his wagon party for nearly 2 hours, maybe 3, walking a route he thought would reconnect him with the trail by nightfall. But the grass had grown taller than he'd expected, 6 to 8 feet in places, dense enough that he couldn't see more than 15 yards in any direction. The sun was gone now, just a pale band of light along the western horizon, and he had maybe 45 minutes before full dark. He stopped walking. Conventional frontier wisdom said keep moving until you find high ground, light a fire if you have the materials, signal your position. But he traveled with Lakota hunters the summer before. Watch them build overnight shelters from nothing but tall grass when fires would have given away their position. The other men in his party had called it primitive, something only Indians would do because they had no tools. He knelt into the grass and began pulling it by the armful. He twisted the grass into bundles 8 to 10 inches thick, each about 3 feet long. The stems were mostly dry bluestem and switchgrass, hollow inside, which meant they'd trap air the same way loose straw insulated a barn floor. He pressed a shallow depression into the ground with his boots and hands, roughly 5 feet long and 2.5 feet wide, just enough to curl up inside. Then he began stacking the bundles in a low dome, no more than 30 inches high at the center. The smaller the air volume, the faster his body heat would warm it. He packed the walls 18 to 24 inches thick, stuffing loose grass into any gaps he could feel with his hands. The dome shape would shed wind rather than catch it, and keeping the profile low meant it wouldn't rise above the surrounding grass tops. He left an entrance gap no wider than a hat brim, sealed at last with a bundle he could pull tight from inside. No fire, no tools, no movement after construction. Just dead air trapped in grass walls and ground contact to block the wind. By midnight the temperature had dropped to near freezing. Outside, a man's fingers would go numb in 20 minutes, dexterity gone, unable to work a rifle or strike a match. He could hear coyotes somewhere between 200 and 300 yards out, their calls carrying across the open prairie. They were drawn to movement, not silence. Inside the shelter the temperature had stabilized around 45 to 50 degrees. The wind noise dropped to a low hiss as the grass absorbed sound. Moisture from his breath dampened the inner layers, which actually increased the insulation density. He curled his knees to his chest, minimizing the surface area exposed to the air, and stayed perfectly still. Army journals and settler accounts would later note grass shelters sustaining individuals through unexpected freezes, though most dismissed them as last-ditch measures. Plains tribes had used similar overnight shelters during hunts when fires were unsafe. Outside, without shelter, his survival window was estimated at 2 to 3 hours before hypothermia set in. At dawn he pulled back the entrance bundle and saw wagon tracks less than 40 yards away. Fresh ruts, deep enough that they'd been made within the last few hours. A mounted search party had passed during the night or early morning, close enough that he could have heard voices if anyone had spoken. They hadn't seen him. The shelter's profile had never risen above the grass tops. No smoke, no movement, no silhouette. Tall grass absorbed sound and broke outlines. The packed grass matched the surrounding color and texture exactly. Search doctrine focused on ridges, fires, and open ground, places where a man would make himself visible. The shelter height remained below knee level. Had he stood, waved, or built a fire the night before, exposure likely would have killed him before anyone arrived. The method had prevented detection, but it had also preserved his life. He stayed low and followed the wagon tracks east until he found the trail. Frontier accounts from the late 1870s and early 1880s began noting survivors found alive, buried in grass after cold nights on the open prairie. Army scouts and plainsmen quietly adopted the method, though few wrote about it in official reports. By the 1890s, grass shelters appeared in survival manuals as an emergency technique for treeless country, described with the same measurements and construction steps he'd used that night. The method demonstrated that concealment and insulation often beat visibility and fire, particularly in environments where wood was scarce and wind was constant. It validated indigenous engineering adapted to the prairie's extremes, techniques that settlers had dismissed as primitive until survival outcomes made denial impossible. The principles influenced later cold weather survival doctrine, emphasizing wind block and dead air over movement and flame. On the open prairie, survival didn't belong to the man who moved the most or signaled the hardest, but to the one who understood that grass, packed tight and kept low, could be warmer than flame and safer than being seen.